You're listening to
DNA ID.
Brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1985, Valentine's Day to be exact, but it was a Thursday, a regular workday for everyone, including John Daniels. John was the regular pest control contractor for the Walnut Ridge Apartments in Arlington, Texas, and his job was to treat the massive complex, including each of its residential units, to ensure rodents and other pests didn't get a foothold. Today, he was spraying for insects. Assisting John in his endeavors was the complex's maintenance man, Dave V. At 2:35 p.m., John knocked on the door to apartment 1214. As expected, no one responded. The vast majority of the tenants were at work during the day. So Dave used his management-issued passkey to open the locked apartment door, and the two men went inside. They walked into the quiet apartment. The TV was on, the volume turned down. This was odd since no one was home. John's first stop was typically the apartment's one bathroom, and that's where he headed. But as he and Dave approached the bathroom, their attention was drawn to the master bedroom door opposite. It stood slightly open. And all over the white paint were tiny red spots. More red spots marred a white blouse hanging on a hanger on the doorknob, to the point that the blouse looked almost polka-dotted. Dave tentatively pushed the door open the rest of the way. There was blood all over the wall-to-wall carpet. A woman was lying on the floor next to the wall. She was clearly the source of all the blood. Dave and John were shocked at the sight inside the bedroom. Their typical employment duties brought them in contact with clogged drains and roaches, not dead bodies. But they had the presence of mind not to touch a thing. Dave and John beelined out of the apartment, and Dave sprinted to the apartment of the complex's security officer. Arlington Police Department Major Case Detective Mike Simons lived at the complex and was the security officer on duty. He calmed Dave down as he was completely out of breath and upset. Dave told him he thought a woman in apartment 1214 had been shot. This was odd because the sole resident of apartment 1214 was a male. Detective Simons went to the apartment to take a look. The woman on the floor, curled up on her side, was almost nude, covered in blood, and cold to the touch. It was time to call the police. At 2:40 p.m., Arlington police officers Mark Thunderberg, Donnie Abrams, and Ben Lambert were summoned to the scene at the Walnut Ridge Apartments, located at 2525 Walnut Hill Circle on Burney Road in North Arlington, reference a possible shooting. They found Detective Simons waiting for them outside the apartment. Mid-City's ambulance had already arrived, and Detective Simons had denied them entry, saying their services were not needed. Now, Detective Simons informed the on-duty officers that it appeared to his seasoned eye to be a homicide, and they had better call in the homicide squad. Crimes Against Persons detectives Jim Ford and Austin Barrett arrived by 3:10 p.m. The detectives entered the apartment to take in the scene, while the door was secured by one of the officers. Meanwhile, Officer Abrams took official statements from John, the pest guy, and Dave, the maintenance guy, at the police station, and then returned to the complex. Detectives Ford and Barrett and Detective Simons continued to observe the scene and take notes. Crime scene investigator Janice Stanton arrived at 3:46 and was soon joined by a second CSI, Desmond Freeman, because the crime scene was deemed to be quite complex. They remained inside the apartment processing it for several hours, for there was a lot to process. The scene inside the bedroom was an incredibly bloody one. There was the blood spatter on the bedroom door and the blouse hung on the knob that had been observed by Dave and John. But inside the bedroom was where the murder had actually happened. The dead woman on the floor, who was wearing only a bra, was lying on her left side, tucked up close to the wall next to the bed. She was in a loose fetal position, with her knees bent and drawn up, and her arms in a pugilistic position near her face. She had been brutalized, but not by a gunshot. Her blonde hair was in a messy bun, and her hair was soaked in blood. It appeared she had been repeatedly hit on the head with a hard object with a sharp aspect to it. Puncture wounds on her temple and forehead were as large as 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Her eye areas were described as extremely blackened. The carpet under her head was soaked in blood. Vomit was observed near her mouth. Low-velocity blood spatter that formed circular patterns on the south wall adjacent to the door itself, and the east wall south of the bed told the CSIs that blows had been inflicted there. Blood on the wall of the bedroom right of the dead woman's head came from her hair coming in contact with the wall. But there was also blood on the bed, which indicated that there were multiple different aspects to this crime scene. It seemed to CSI Stanton that the bed had been made up prior to the incident. It had brown, neatly folded over striped sheets on it and pillows with matching cases. But right in the center of the bed was a pool of blood. On the floor towards the foot of the bed near the woman's feet, its corner still on the bed, was a brown striped comforter. Nearby were a red multicolor quilt, a white sweater, a gray sweater, and pink sweatpants. All these items had bloodstains on them. Small pieces of bone were observed on the gray sweater, surmised to have flown from the woman's head when she was hit. CSI Stanton noted with interest that the woman had hairs or fibers visible between the fingers of her tightly clenched fists. She also had faint linear bruises on her right hip, and a distinctive but minor injury on her left buttock, which was a bruise consisting of 2 horizontal parallel lines 1/8 of an inch long and 1/16 of an inch apart. And on the inside of her thighs were bloody hand and fingerprints. These marks were also on the backs of her knees, but the prints were not sufficiently clear to interpret palm or fingerprint ridge details. On the edge of the bed directly above the victim was a clump of hair, which appeared to be consistent with her own. Another clump of hair lay on the floor between the bed and the victim's legs. Tarrant County Medical Investigator Seabury arrived at 6:20 and began his investigation of the body. It was observed that the victim appeared to be in fixed rigor, consistent with being dead for about 12 hours, with faint livor mortis on the left side of the body, which was consistent with the position in which she was found. Seabury and the CSIs turned the dead woman over onto her back to take photos of her face for identification purposes, and noted that her arms and legs remained stiff. This is when they noted several additional wounds, including a large bludgeon or puncture wound on the outside of her right eye that had partially caved in her skull. They carefully examined and photographed all the bloody prints on the victim's inner thighs and the back of her knees, and collected numerous blood samples from various locations on the body to ascertain if the suspect might have been injured during the assault. Of course, the only way they would be able to determine this was through serology testing of the various bloodstains in the event 2 different blood types were detected. Then CSI Stanton carefully enclosed the woman's hands and head in brown paper bags to preserve evidence. At 7:39 p.m., 2 Meissner Brown ambulance attendants arrived. They wrapped the dead woman in a sterile sheet and removed her body at 8:08 p.m. Skipping back a little bit in time, Detective Ford interviewed the apartment manager, who informed him that the tenant of apartment 1214 was a white male by the name of Jeff B. His girlfriend was the resident of apartment 224, named Terri McAdams. Officers were dispatched to check the complex's massive parking lot for the 2 vehicles registered to these tenants, listed on the respective leases as a charcoal BMW and a blue Mazda RX-7. There was no answer at Terri McAdams' apartment. So the detectives knew that the woman on the floor in the wrong apartment might be the resident's girlfriend, Terri McAdams. And sure enough, a blue wallet was found on the floor near the dead woman's body under the comforter. Inside was a Texas driver's license, a University of Texas Arlington student ID card, and various credit cards, all in the name of Terri McAdams. Also on the kitchen counter were several W-2 forms and papers that had Terri McAdams' name on them, as well as some school textbooks in the dining room that had her name on them as well. A heart-shaped cake sat on the kitchen counter. It looked to the detectives like Terri had been in her boyfriend's unit baking a cake for him for Valentine's Day. Instead of enjoying the decadent results of her culinary labors, Terri was viciously beaten, stripped, assaulted, and left to die. Hi guys, it's Jess, here to talk to you again about Manscaped. Now that Thanksgiving's over and full-fledged holiday shopping panic is setting in, it's the perfect time to talk about the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra by Manscaped. We all have men in our lives who need this all-in-one set because those men all have man hair. Let him know he needs to trim more than just his tree this holiday season by gifting him the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra. The Lawn Mower 5.0 Ultra Groin Body Hair Trimmer will help him get it done. And finish up with the icing on the Yule log, the Crop Soother Ball Aftershave Lotion and Crop Preserver Anti-Chafing Ball Deodorant. Also included is the Weed Whacker 2.0 Ear and Nose Hair Trimmer, which cuts down those unsightly hairs that no one wants to stare at over their cup of eggnog. And all those goodies come with a free pair of cozy Midnight Bravo boxers and the Shed 2.0 toiletry bag for on-the-go maintenance, because those hairs just don't stop growing even if he's on the road. Help the man in your life prep his balls to deck the halls with the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra by Manscaped. Get 20% off plus free shipping with the code DNAID at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the code DNAID, all one word, at manscaped.com. Help him stay on top of his grooming game and be ready for anything the season throws his way. Terri was brought into the autopsy suite on February 15th, nude but for her blood-stained white bra and some jewelry. 2 necklaces, a ring, and earrings. Short, straight, light brown hairs clutched in her hands were collected and catalogued. An unknown substance on the outside of her right elbow had been swabbed at the scene by the CSIs, and another unknown substance was collected from the outside of her left leg. These substances to this day have never been identified. The pathologist, Dr. Mark Krause of the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office, observed that Terri had 9 penetrating lacerations to the right side of her face and the center back of her head, consistent with being bludgeoned with a heavy, sharp object. This object had a flat, round surface about 7/8 of an inch in diameter. Some of the blows had fractured and caved in her skull, and some had left half-moon-shaped lacerations as though inflicted at an angle. The murder weapon was posited to likely be a hammer. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the astonishing brutality with which Terri was killed. Suffice it to say that her skull was broken open and brain matter and shards of bone were found in the bedroom. What's horrifying is that the official cause of death was actually exsanguination and blunt force injuries to the head. Terri had bled to death. The blows had caused brain damage, which in turn caused respiratory failure. But Terri had been alive after the attack and had actually bled so profusely from her head that her death was attributed to blood loss. This explained the facial swelling and black eyes, bruising on her body, the minimal livor mortis observed on the body, and the massive amount of blood found in the bedroom. As I said, the official cause of death was exsanguination due to cerebral and intracranial arterial lacerations due to blunt force injuries of the head. The manner of death was homicide, possibly by a left-handed offender, based on the location of the injuries to Terri's face and head. Dr. Krause also noted that Terri had a lacerated labia, contusions inside the vagina, and contusions to the cervix, all of which were indicative of sexual assault. Bloody handprints were observed on the inside of Terri's thighs and the backs of her knees. The attacker had forced her legs open, presumably to facilitate sexual assault after Terri had been incapacitated by the blows. Her forearms were bloody as well, possibly from being forcibly restrained by a bloodied attacker. Dr. Krause estimated the time of death at between 10:30 p.m. on the 13th and 3 a.m. on the 14th. Vaginal, oral, and rectal swabs were collected. Fingernail clippings and blood and hair standards from Terri were collected as well. Fingerprint exemplars were collected for elimination purposes in the apartment and in her car. All of these items, as well as the transport sheet and the brown bags Terri's extremities had been placed in, and her bra and jewelry, were placed in evidence by the Arlington police. Let's talk about who Terri was. Teresa Ann McAdams was born on December 3, 1962, to parents Larry and Ann McAdams. She grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, with younger sisters Karen, just 2 years younger, and Pamela. Her parents divorced, and it was ugly, with prolonged court battles over child support payments. But Terri, as she was known to all, was a happy, fun-loving girl whom her mother described as the family ringleader. She had a great sense of humor and loved to tease and laugh. Terri loved music and was known for racing around in her MG convertible, blasting the Gap band from the 8-track player. She was very close with her sisters, particularly Karen, 2 years younger almost to the day. When it was time, Terri taught both her younger sisters to drive. She studied dance for years, which was perfect for her tiny 5'3", 102-pound frame. After high school at Little Rock Central High, the blonde, green-eyed beauty enrolled at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, joining the Razorback cheer squad and Phi Mu sorority. She was popular and very well liked. Her mother, Anne, later said Terri grew into a very giving young woman who was uncomfortable with anyone else being unhappy. She was someone who would elicit smiles from others, even if they were feeling down, her family said. At UA, Terri met her best friend, Farah, and the two had traveled to Europe together. Terri still loved to talk about her sighting of Prince Charles and Lady Di there. While a freshman at UA, Terri also met Jeff B., and the two started dating seriously. Jeff was a little older and after graduation lived in Tulsa for 6 months and then got a job that relocated him to the Fort Worth, Texas area. He and Terri did the long-distance thing until August of 1984, when Terri transferred to the University of Texas, Arlington. Her sister Karen went to SMU in Dallas, so her family was used to traveling to the area. Terri enrolled at UT in the fall semester of '84 as a junior finance major. She had switched around her major a number of times. She worked in the financial aid department of the university. As mentioned, she and her fiancé Jeff lived in the same apartment complex. After her murder, Terri's friends told the detectives that she maintained her own apartment, so her parents would not know that she actually lived with Jeff. She preferred to stay at his apartment even when he was out of town, partially because he had a washer-dryer and she could do laundry without going to the laundromat in the apartment complex. Terri and Jeff also jointly owned their brand new BMW 318i, which Terri's grandmother and Jeff split the payments for. Terri had traded in her Mazda RX-7, purchased for her by her grandmother, toward the purchase price of the BMW. When she was killed, Terri was busy planning her December 1985 wedding to Jeff in Little Rock, although, as we will hear, there is significant doubt as to whether that wedding would actually have happened. Instead of returning to her hometown in a wedding dress, Terri returned in a casket. Her funeral was at Pulaski Heights Methodist Church, and she was buried in Rest Hills Memorial Park in Little Rock. Now let's talk about the setting where this murder occurred. Arlington, Texas is a suburb in the DFW area of Texas. It's primarily residential and was generally considered quite safe, although, as we will hear, the typical trend of 7 or 8 annual murders in Arlington did not mean that women like Terri were safe there. The Walnut Ridge apartment complex in northeastern Arlington was a year-old high-end complex of more than 150 units, inhabited by primarily young Caucasian professionals. Highway 360 passed close by the complex, which was accessible from Burney Road. In general, the complex was considered safe. It consisted of multiple 3-story buildings connected by breezeways. Jeff lived in Building 12 in the center of the complex, and his apartment was in the middle of the rectangular building. Jeff's apartment was a 1-bedroom ground-floor apartment with 1 bathroom and a living room and kitchen. The apartment also featured 2 sets of sliding glass doors, one from the bedroom and one from the living room, which led out to the concrete patio. When I read about the patio, I envisioned a large outdoor area, but this was not the case at all. The patio was balcony-sized, but just happened to be on the ground floor. It had a solid wooden railing/fence around it, approximately 4 feet in height, and no gate or other opening to the sidewalk outside. The patio where Terri and Jeff would sometimes grill was not accessible by someone on the sidewalk unless they were to jump over the wooden railing. Detective Ford obtained the passkey to Terri's apartment in Building 2. Nothing there looked out of place in the slightest. Photos of Terri and a man presumed to be Jeff adorned the furniture. But it did not appear from the interior of this apartment that anything at all had happened there. Everything went down at Jeff's place. Jeff's apartment was noted to be very neat and tidy. Nothing appeared to have been ransacked or rifled. It was also not apparently a bachelor pad. It was clear, from women's clothing in the bedroom closet and drawers and other feminine accoutrements in the bathroom, that Terri was basically living there. The TV was on in the living room. In the kitchen of the apartment, detectives observed a heart-shaped cake sitting on the counter. Icing writing said, "Happy Valentine's Day." A second heart-shaped cake, this one reading, "Happy Valentine's Day, Jeff," was found inside the microwave. A nearly full container of Yoplait yogurt, with the spoon still in it, sat on the counter too, which was sort of incongruous with the orderliness of the place. A full glass of orange juice sat on the counter too. Instant oatmeal packets were in the trash, and an oatmeal-crusted bowl was in the dishwasher. But most significantly of all, the back left burner of the stovetop was turned on low. Terri had been interrupted while cooking and eating in the kitchen. Something brought her into the bedroom. From a police report, quote, "Blood spattered on the walls in the bedroom reflected a violent struggle confined to the bedroom," end quote. In the bedroom, amidst the disarray of the bedding and the sweaters on the floor, which were guessed to have been folded on the bed, were found a blue sweatshirt, a pair of bloodied pink sweatpants, and a pair of white sock slipper combination booties. These were found bunched up in a pile at the foot of the bed, quote, "as though the suspect had pulled off the clothing all at one time and left it in that location. One slipper was still caught in the elastic ankle of the sweatpants, possibly indicating that they had been pulled off in one motion. The pants were bunched together as if they had been removed by pulling downward by the waistband. In order to avoid any chance of losing vital trace evidence, the pants were not opened to see if there were panties inside," end quote. Spoiler, there weren't. No underwear were ever located. All of these things were found underneath the comforter on the floor, meaning that Terri had been stripped before the comforter was pulled off the bed. There was a large bloodstain on the bed that indicated that Terri had been on the bed sometime after she'd been hit. According to the report, the detectives surmised she had been placed and held down on the bed for some period of time. This comported with the medical examiner's theory that Terri had been sexually assaulted. Some very important evidentiary material was found by CSI Stanton. Cigarette ashes were strewn on the sheet near the edge of the bed and continued across the comforter on the floor at the end of the bed, where a 1/2-inch tube of ash lay as though the suspect had smoked a cigarette after killing Terri. Stanton's report says, quote, "A cardboard match and a cigarette were found on the floor near the bed. The cigarette butt has scorched the carpet," end quote. The cigarette lay on the floor close to the south wall and partially under a chair. It had been flicked there. The cigarette made a small burn mark where it hit, and it burned a hole in the carpet as it burned itself out. The match was found on the floor just north of the doorway. CSI Desmond noted that this was all consistent with a left-handed person standing by the victim's feet, lighting, smoking, and discarding the cigarette. CSI Desmond posited, based on the blood spatter on the bedroom door and wall, that a left-hand person struck Terri on the right side of her head or face as she walked into the bedroom. Detective Ford's notes drew very similar conclusions. Quote, "From the position of the puddle of blood on the carpet and the brain matter and skull fragments, it appears that the victim was struck in the right side of the head while she was standing just inside the bedroom with her back next to the bedroom door. This would be consistent with the blood spatter on the bedroom door and on the south wall of the apartment. It is also possible that the suspect might be left-handed due to the location and direction of the wounds to the victim's head. It appears that after the victim was struck while standing in front of the bedroom door, she fell to the floor in a northward direction. Due to the position of the victim's clothing lying on the bedroom floor, it is conceivable that she was undressed at that point. The victim appeared to have been wearing a blue sweatshirt, a pair of pink sweatpants, and sock-type booties that were located still inside the legs of the victim's sweatpants. After the victim's clothing was removed, it's conceivable that she was then positioned on the bed with her head approximately in the center of the bed and her feet dangling off the south edge of the bed. There was a large puddle of blood in the center of the bed, which had soaked through all the sheets and deep into the mattress, indicating that she had bled a considerable amount while at that location. After the bed sheets had been preserved for trace evidence and removed from the bed, I observed that the mattress cover of the bed was moved slightly in a northward position. The position of the blood stains, the position of the mattress cover, and the bloody handprints on the inside of the victim's thighs are all indicative of the victim being placed on the bed and sexually assaulted while at that location. The victim may then have either fallen to the floor or been removed to the floor to her current position where she was found. It is conceivable that the suspect then lit and smoked a cigarette prior to leaving the apartment," end quote. Detectives quickly learned that neither Terri nor Jeff smoked. The Winston Light 100 cigarette butt was collected into evidence. Theories that Terri had possibly hosted someone for a romantic encounter in the bedroom were quickly dismissed. With Terri having her own apartment nearby, it seemed unlikely that she would be having an illicit tryst in her boyfriend's bedroom. She was in the midst of making him a heart-shaped cake, for God's sake. Furthermore, it didn't appear that she had granted access to the apartment. Remember that John and Dave had found the apartment's front door locked when they went to service it. There was no indication that anyone had tried to jimmy with his door. And a sliding glass door that led into the living room from the patio outside was also locked. But there was another sliding glass door leading from the patio into the master bedroom. This was the kind of slider where one glass panel is fixed and the other is a sliding door that slides back and doubles up against the fixed one. This sliding glass door was found standing open about 2 feet. The exterior round lock plug was missing, and pry or tool marks were found surrounding the hole and inside the lock mechanism. Metal shavings told the investigators that these pry marks were fresh. The missing plug was never located, and the plug on the outside section of the dining room area sliding door showed scratch marks that were consistent with an attempt to remove it as well. Someone had broken in.
Every day, predators are targeting children and teens online. The Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect campaign provides resources to combat online child exploitation and abuse. Learn how you can help protect our kids online and join the fight. Visit knowtoprotect.gov so together we can stop online child exploitation. That's KNOW, protect.gov.
There was more evidence that someone had come in through the sliding glass doors to the bedroom. A deep, distinct shoe print was found in the dirt on the other side of the patio railing/fence. It was made, detectives thought, when the suspect jumped down from the fence while making his escape. CSI Stanton was charged with creating plaster casts of the shoe print. She also photographed it using 35mm film. In the bathroom, again, the room was neat and tidy. No bloodstains or wet towels were evident anywhere. The only thing of note was a pubic hair found in the toilet, which was collected. Outside the apartment, officers were instructed to cordon off the 2 apartment complex dumpsters with crime scene tape and make sure nothing went in or out. Upon his arrival on the morning of the 15th, Officer Martin, a crime scene investigator, was assigned to examine the contents of the 2 dumpsters for possible weapons or bloody clothing. He and Officer Harris sorted through the dumpsters located in the apartment complex lot west of the crime scene and didn't locate any evidence. Meanwhile, 7 patrol officers were instructed to conduct a grid search of an area extending 150 yards out from the apartment, including searching woods that abutted the complex. They collected a bunch of items, but nothing that turned out to be related to the crime. They also checked all the back doors of the other ground floor apartments in the complex. One other apartment was missing the plate on the sliding glass door. Back at Jeff's, CSI Freeman collected a soil sample from the flower bed outside the apartment patio. Photos of the crime scene were obtained and everything was measured and sketched out as well. CSI's Freeman and Stanton dusted for prints using black fingerprint powder. They dusted the entire patio door and frame, light switches and switch plates, the bedroom door and door frame, the wall near where Terri was lying, and the top of the bedroom dresser. They also dusted the bathroom, including countertops, light switches, and walls. They dusted the yogurt container and OJ glass in the kitchen in case someone other than Terri had consumed them. Several latent fingerprint lifts were developed and lifted using frosted tape, including one very important latent print lifted from the left inside surface of the movable section of the bedroom patio door. All the bedding, the clothing including the bone fragments found on the gray sweater, the clumps of hair and the toilet hair, the cigarette and match, the wallet, the samples of the blood on the walls, all this was collected. The brown carpet was collected where it was stained, and pieces of bone and brain matter lay on it. The lock mechanisms of the sliding glass door were collected to preserve the pry marks scratched into them. As was the curtain which covered the doors, it was found pulled closed because it was determined to have a blood smear on the back, on the door side, about 4 feet from the floor. Both door handles to the slider were collected as well. CSI Freeman was also ordered to collect the drain traps in the bathroom. Nothing of interest was found in any of the trash receptacles. All the evidence and lifts were brought back to the APD and marked, tagged, packaged, and entered into the appropriate evidence logs. Terri's car and apartment keys were found on the dining room table in Jeff's apartment. It was determined that Terri was driving a Plymouth Reliant K car from Jeff's company, as the couple's BMW was in the shop after being backed into in the parking lot. The car had been sealed shut with red evidence tape by the overnight crime scene preservation officers. CSI Martin broke the seals and dusted the vehicle interior and exterior for prints and collected latent prints, but these were never connected to anyone. The theory of the crime was, and remains, that the entire confrontation went down in the bedroom of the apartment. Investigators believed, based on the picked slider lock, the open door, and the blood on the curtain, that the bedroom slider was the point of entry and exit. This guy would have been covered in blood. The blood he left on the curtain proved that someone had to have seen him. It was time to canvass the neighbors. Officer Lambert started knocking on doors to the apartments in Jeff's building around 3 p.m. The residents of apartment 1213 had just arrived home at 2 p.m. and heard nothing. The resident of apartment 1219, Pete N., had been home all day and heard nothing. The resident of apartment 1216, directly across the hall from Jeff, Cynthia P., slept from 9:30 to 5:30 a.m. and heard nothing. None of the other building tenants answered the door, and it was learned that most of them were American Airlines employees who were often away. No one at all reported hearing screams or seeing someone with lockpicking tools prowling the area. Officers also wisely checked with the neighbors near Terri's actual apartment, number 224, in a different building. Officer Madden contacted the resident of apartment 220, a Thomas B., who lived directly underneath Terri. Thomas said he never heard any noise from there. In general, neighbors reported that Terri, whom they knew only by sight, kept to herself and was cordial but not chatty. They mostly saw Terri walking between her apartment and Jeff's apartment. No one had seen or heard anything useful. Okay, so back to the scene where detectives and CSIs were processing the apartment and gathering information. Detective Ford learned from the lease papers that Jeff was employed by Lever Brothers, Park Avenue, New York. His absence was noted with interest. But then Terri's supervisor and friend from work, Charlotte, called the apartment. Detectives Barrett and Ford made the decision to answer the phone on the theory that they could gain some information. Charlotte was looking for Terri, who had not come into work. Charlotte told them that Terri pretty much lived at her fiancé Jeff's apartment, and Jeff was on a business trip in Oklahoma, due to come home on Friday night. Several more calls came into the apartment phone. One was from Ann McAdams, Terri's mother. The medical examiner's investigator Seabury had to inform her that her daughter was dead. Soon thereafter, Terri's father Larry called to verify the news. They both said they were on their way to Arlington. Then around 4 p.m., with the crime scene investigation in full swing, Jeff called the apartment from the Tulsa airport. Detective Barrett decided it was best not to tell Jeff what was going on. He could be a suspect. Barrett just told him something had happened and he needed to get home ASAP. At 7:35 p.m., while the parking lot was swarming with the members of the media who had assembled, Terri's body was about to be removed by ambulance personnel and the apartment was still being processed. Jeff pulled up in a taxi. An officer was watching out for him and notified Detective Barrett that Jeff had arrived. Barrett approached the taxi and broke the news to Jeff that his fiancée had been killed. Jeff became emotional and then hysterical and was taken down to the police station to get him away from the media cameras. At Arlington PD headquarters, Jeff was questioned by Detectives Barrett and Ford. He was read his rights and was hard to understand because he was so upset and crying. He produced his plane ticket for the detectives to copy. It showed that he had flown back from Tulsa that afternoon, and he told them he'd been in Tulsa for work when Terri was suspected to have been killed. The detectives worked with Jeff to learn some more information about Terri. They went over the clothing they'd found, the sweatpants, slippers, and so on, and he said they sounded like typical items of clothing she owned. They went over the jewelry found on the dresser and the jewelry Terri was wearing. Anything missing from that list? Well, yes. Terri, Jeff said, always wore the $5,000 3/4-carat solitaire gold engagement ring he'd given her. She never took it off. No ring was found on Terri's finger at her autopsy. Her clothing and jewelry had been itemized and collected into evidence, and the medical examiner had seen no diamond ring. It was missing. It was not discovered in Terri's apartment. If she had possibly removed it when baking the cake, it was nowhere to be found. There was something else. Jeff told the detectives that just 2 days earlier, on February 12th, Terri had called him in Tulsa and told him that she just returned to the apartment and found the sliding glass door leading into the bedroom unlocked. She was freaked out, but because nothing was missing from the apartment and it didn't appear to have been ransacked, she decided not to file a police report. She locked it and seemed to move on. The interview with Jeff was terminated because he was so distraught. Police decided to issue a news release to the media about the murder in the Walnut Ridge complex, hoping to elicit some information from the public. The apartment building's management also held a meeting for concerned residents, seeking information and advising of increased security measures in the buildings. People were frightened and unsettled. Detective Ford canceled a family vacation and resolved to find Terri's killer. Police worked to establish when Terri had last been seen alive to help them pinpoint the time at which the murder had occurred. On Monday, February 11th, around 7:45 a.m., Jeff and Terri dropped the BMW off at the shop in Fort Worth. Then Terri drove Jeff to the airport, where his flight took off at 8:45 a.m. He was scheduled to return to the area on Friday. Terri went to her regular classes that day as far as anyone knows. That evening around 7:30, she ate dinner with her friend Joseph C. at Mama's Pizza. Later that night, Jeff called and Terri told him that she'd found the patio door unlocked. On Tuesday the 12th, Terri went to her classes at UT Arlington. She spoke with her friend Tony and her friend Joseph C., whom she told about the unlocked patio door and how it freaked her out. Around 4:45 p.m., she had an important interaction with a guy named Brent that we'll get into shortly. On the 13th, the last day of her life, she attended classes at UT Arlington, marketing, accounting, and business administration. She ate lunch with Judy Smith and Rick Clark, and then went to her shift at the financial aid department, where she was reported by coworkers to be behaving completely normally. She finished up around 4 p.m., according to her friend and supervisor, Charlotte. She returned to Jeff's apartment, and her friend Terri W. came over for a visit because Terri had asked Terri W. to go to the Players Club with her that night. But Terri W. was too tired, so they just visited for a little while. Then Terri W. left, and our Terri left again at approximately 5:50 and went to Reno Cleaners in North Arlington to pick up her dry cleaning. As an aside, Terri was a regular customer at this dry cleaning service and everyone knew her there. The owner confirmed to APD Detective Larry Bloom that Terri had been in there on Wednesday evening. She then went back to the apartment complex, and at 6:15, phone records showed she tried to call Jeff at the Marriott in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was out. She then went out again and went to the Safeway grocery store on East Lamar in North Arlington. She selected her items and checked out with groceries at 6:32 p.m. She then went back to her complex. Her neighbor, Jeff Thompson, saw her coming home with bags of groceries and some flowers. She was wearing a red blouse and black slacks. She put the groceries away and made several phone calls to friends and her sister Karen. Local friends she spoke with included this guy Brent, and female friends Tony J. and Terri W. The two Terris spoke on the phone around 10:30 p.m. Terri told Terri W. she was cooking and doing the laundry. She said she had just made a cake for Jeff and a quiche for herself. And they discussed a rash of murders that was going on in Fort Worth, in which young white women were being slain. After that, no one knows what happened. At 2 a.m., Jeff called the apartment and there was no answer. Terri did not show up for work on the 14th. Remember that her time of death was estimated to be between 10:30 on the 13th and 3 a.m. on the 14th, per the pathologist. But I think we can agree that the attack likely occurred on the earlier end of that time frame, because we know that Terri was still up, eating a yogurt, drinking her orange juice, the stove was on, and the cake was just sitting on the counter. Terri had not yet gone to bed. Detectives Ford, Barrett, and Simons spent a lot of time interviewing everyone they could think of, Terri's Texas and Arkansas friends, her coworkers, her schoolmates, people in the complex. They also spent some time assisting Terri's family, who arrived in town from Arkansas, in handling funeral arrangements and Terri's affairs. Terri's father, Larry, unfortunately was not handling his daughter's death well. Who would? He was actually arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. He threatened to sue the police for false arrest, and he tried numerous times to demand entrance to the murder scene so he could see it, which was a bad idea and was disallowed. Ann Adams was as helpful as she could be in her distraught state, but since she lived in a different state, she didn't have too much information to share. Remember that Terri had somewhat deceived her parents about her living arrangements. What about motive, police wondered. Terri's diamond ring was stolen. That was incontrovertible as it was never found. Her wallet also was found on the bedroom floor, leading to the conclusion that it had possibly been rifled through. But the remainder of the jewelry on her body was untouched. She wore 2 necklaces, earrings, and a pearl ring. Also on the dresser in the bedroom were several Seiko wristwatches, one of which was valued at $200. There were also gold bracelets, gold necklaces, and gold diamond rings. $2 bills were untouched as well. Television sets and stereos were found in the apartment too. Detective Ford's notes say, quote, "I would like to add that the bedroom itself was not ransacked and was very neat and orderly, other than the crime scene elements that I have described. It would seem that the suspect was not interested in burglary or robbery as a motive," end quote. Other investigators agreed. APD Captain Dennis Roten told the media that the lack of robbery indicated they were looking for someone who had targeted Terri specifically. Plus, it was felt Terri was targeted because she'd been beaten so badly that her face was reported by many media publications as being unrecognizable. 1 blow would have been enough to kill her. 7 was total overkill. Captain Roten went on, quote, "This type of murder cries out that the victim knew the killer. You look at robbery, you look at burglary, you look at rape," end quote. This, of course, raised the issue of sexual assault as the motive. Well, there was some confusion on that. The pathologist Dr. Krause explained to Detective Ford that he suspected that Terri had been sexually assaulted because she had a lacerated labia, contusions inside her vagina, and contusions to her cervix. But when the lab results came back from Dallas Forensic Lab, no sperm, semen, or phosphates indicative of seminal fluid were located on any of the swabs or smears. But then Dr. Krause told Detective Ford that when he did the autopsy and collected a vaginal smear, he examined the slide under his microscope and believed that he saw motile sperm. But then again, quote, "He was not completely sure of these findings as his equipment was not the best equipment available for examining these types of samples," end quote. In the end, the investigators leaned toward sexual assault, given the fact that Terri was found 98% nude and had severe injuries to her genital area. The media was informed that Terri had been raped. But the lack of seminal fluid meant that testing to determine the suspect's blood type, one of the identifying factors heavily considered in this era, would not be effective. So the odd lack of motive in this case, the burglars' ignoring of the jewelry, watches, and electronics lying around, aroused the suspicions of the detectives. The only thing stolen was Terri's engagement ring, given to her by Jeff. And Jeff was conveniently out of town when this happened. He was scheduled to be away until Friday night, but suddenly showed up at DFW on Thursday night. Detectives found this odd. Finally, and very notably, Jeff was left-handed, like only about 10% of the population. Could Jeff have been behind this whole thing? Could he have engineered the attack on his fiancé, the stealing of the ring as a symbolic F.U. gesture? Well, weirder things have happened. Jeff said he had an alibi. He was out of town on a business trip. Hotel phone records verified that he had tried to call his apartment in Arlington, Texas, from his room in Tulsa, Oklahoma, around 2 a.m. on the night of the 13th. Also, police noted he wouldn't have had to break into his own apartment to kill Terri. It was theoretically possible they had a fight and she locked him out, but again, he claimed to be out of town during the window of time in which Terri was believed to have died. But there were lots of reasons that police were stuck on Jeff. A former girlfriend of Jeff's was interviewed extensively about a week after Terri's slaying. Valerie F. did not have very nice things to say about him, but of course, detectives take the comments of exes with a grain of salt. Also, Valerie and Jeff had dated in high school several years earlier. Valerie basically said that in public, Jeff treated her like a queen, but in private, he had a bad temper and physically struck her on more than one occasion. He called her demeaning names and was possessive, jealous, and unable to deal with rejection. Jeff was a member of the Pike fraternity at the University of Arkansas and had a lot of fraternity brothers who were very closely bonded. This information gave police the idea that while Jeff may not have personally killed Terri, he very well could have had someone else do it. Detective Barrett interviewed Terri's best friend, Tony J. She had spoken with Terri on the last night of her life, chatting with her on the phone on the 13th about 9:30 p.m. She was sure of the time because they talked after Dynasty ended at 9. Terri was in the middle of making Jeff a second Valentine's Day cake because the first one had fallen. That explained the 2 cakes, indicating that Terri was committed to pleasing Jeff. But Tony had some interesting things to say about Jeff and Terri's relationship. She said Jeff was extremely jealous and possessive, and the two argued a lot. In fact, the previous November, they'd gotten into a shoving match after Jeff went into a jealous rage after finding Terri at lunch with a male friend. Terri's lip got split open in the struggle. Tony said that Terri was having second thoughts about the engagement and had said so as recently as February 12th. She told her she was confused about whether she wanted to marry Jeff or not. Jeff was planning to relocate to Houston for work in a few short weeks and wanted Terri to go with him. But Terri said that instead she was considering canceling the engagement. She didn't want to leave school in the middle of the semester and lose all her credit hours. Tony said Terri was definitely struggling with this whole thing. Detective Ford spoke with a Bradley C. Brad said he was a good friend of Terri's since the previous fall, as they'd shared some classes at UT Arlington, and Brad worked at Terri's favorite clothing store, William Bradley's, where she shopped often. Brad told the detective that as soon as he heard Terri had been killed, his first thoughts were that her fiancé Jeff was responsible. Quote, he stated that he's had several long conversations with Terri, and he had the impression that Jeff was extremely jealous and that Jeff put Terri down a lot, end quote. Brad confirmed the story that Jeff had hit Terri. He said Terri told him about a fight she had with Jeff the previous November, where Jeff was driving and they got into an argument. Jeff parked the BMW, got out, came around to her side, and pulled her out of her car by her hair and hit her, splitting her lip. Terri had to miss several days of classes in the wake of this event. Terri also told her friend Joseph C. that she was having a lot of problems with Jeff. He was very jealous and possessive and would constantly call her at night and get angry if she wasn't there to answer the phone. He didn't want her to go out even with her girlfriends. He was also pressuring her to leave school in the middle of the semester and move to Houston with him. Joseph, too, said that Terri was having second thoughts about marrying Jeff. Several of Terri's other friends and coworkers said she never came out and said this, but they sensed that she was a little bit afraid of Jeff. And then there was the thing with Brent. Terri's friend Tony J. confided to Detective Ford about a guy named Brent who was in Terri's accounting class. Terri was very ashamed of this, but she had cheated on Jeff with Brent. Just once, but still, she felt guilty and upset with herself. And this had just happened. Tony learned about it in the phone call she had with Terri on the last night of her life, February 13th. Terri told Tony that she had sexual relations with Brent on the day before that conversation, February 12th. Could Jeff have found out about Brent and come home and killed Terri, or paid someone else to do it? Detective Simons interviewed Ann McAdams at Terri's apartment on February 21st. She said shortly before Thanksgiving, Terri told her that Jeff had seen her having lunch with a male friend and had hit her. The McAdams family felt that Jeff was very jealous and wouldn't let Terri out of his sight. They noted that after her murder, Jeff picked out the pallbearers, the church where the funeral was held, and even the clothes Terri would be buried in. In other words, he was a control freak. Jeff's brother's ex-wife also told the detectives of an incident in college when Jeff had shot at a guy whom he'd been in a fight with. Jeff refused ever to return to the apartment where Terri had been killed. He did not sit down for any additional interviews with police. All communications were over the phone. Before the funeral, he asked the detectives to go inside the apartment and obtain a white blouse and blue skirt that he specified he wanted to have Terri buried in. He also requested the jewelry she was wearing and requested that they again look for the engagement ring. Detective Ford and Detective Jay Gustafson drove to the scene and went inside and obtained the clothing, but they couldn't locate the engagement ring. The jewelry she was wearing was evidence and needed to be retained by the police. Over the phone, detectives asked Jeff about Brent. They didn't tell him about the infidelity, but were fishing to see if he knew about it. Jeff said only that he was aware that Terri hung out with some guy named Brent from her accounting class. Right after the murder, Jeff and his father left for Arkansas so Jeff could mourn with his family. Detectives could not get Jeff to agree to come back to Arlington and sit down with them. Detective Ford interviewed Terri's friend Terri W., a waitress at the Steak and Ale in Arlington. She had been to see Terri at Jeff's apartment on the 13th and had spoken with Terri on the phone from Jeff's apartment at around 10:30 on the night of the 13th. It was believed that she was the last person to speak with Terri. She said Terri was behaving normally and chatted about the cake she made for Jeff. They talked about mundane things like the fact that Terri had been to the grocery store earlier and bought $40 worth of groceries, including the cake ingredients and some flowers for Jeff. These were found in the apartment. Terri W. could think of no one who would want to harm Terri McAdams. She certainly didn't think Jeff would have done it. But interestingly, Terri W. said that she had a conversation on that night with Terri McAdams about the murders of white women in Fort Worth. Quote, Terri McAdams stated she was afraid to go out at night and would not go to Fort Worth because of the current serial murders. Okay, so I have to explain what was going on here. Late 1984 into early 1985 saw the beginning of a string of murders of white women in their 20s in the southwest Fort Worth area. By January 27th, there had been 5 of them in a 6-mile radius. They were all women going about their daily business when they were taken, raped, and killed. These 5 unsolved murders seemed random and haphazard, striking fear into the hearts of many young women in the area, Terri included. This from the New York Times in January 1985, quote, "The string of disappearances and deaths has had an unnerving effect on residents, particularly women. On Wednesday, when the police sponsored a free seminar on self-defense, more than 3,000 people, the vast majority of them women, showed up. The women in this town are really scared," said Officer Ray Dunaway, end quote. A massive task force of 30 investigators had been hastily assembled to put an end to the rash of murders of women haunting the Southwest Fort Worth area in late '84 and early 1985. Terri, no doubt, noted that 4 of the 5 Fort Worth victims were blonde. All were petite young women who led normal lifestyles. 3 of them attended the same church. Terri's case was not in Fort Worth, though, and there was a significant difference between Terri's case and the Fort Worth murders. The Fort Worth victims were found outdoors, dumped in fields, woods, streams, beside railroad tracks. But Terri felt she fit the victimology to a T, and she was scared. This rash of slayings of women like her had Terri so afraid of what was going on that she quit her job at Dillard's in Irving, Texas, a job that required her to close the store and drive home alone very late. That's why she started working at the University of Texas Arlington campus instead. She could be home before dark. She didn't go out at night alone, even for groceries. And she and her mother talked on the phone at least once a day after Terri started sending her mother newspaper clippings about the murders. It was Ann McAdams who told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, quote, "She was terrified. All the girls who disappeared or were killed were about her age, and they were young, pretty girls. She was really careful about not going out at night, and she was taking every precaution she thought necessary. She was extremely cautious and careful. Even though you're doing that, I guess you can't do enough," end quote. Terri's best friend, Tony J., told Detective Ford that, quote, "Terri was a very paranoid person and was constantly aware of the potential of someone burglarizing the apartment or harming her. She would not let anyone into the apartment unless she knew who that person was," end quote. Everyone also said Terri didn't really go to bars or clubs, and she didn't drink or do drugs. As Detective Mike Simons said of Terri, quote, "If there was ever a case of an innocent victim, this was it."
Every day, predators are targeting children and teens online. The Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect campaign provides resources to combat online child exploitation and abuse. Learn how you can help protect our kids online and join the fight. Visit knowtoprotect.gov so together we can stop online child exploitation. That's KNOW, the number 2, protect.gov.
Okay, back to the Terri-specific investigation. On the 18th, when Detective Ford came into the station on his day off to work on Terri's case, a Wendell B., described as a white male, came in to speak with the investigator in charge of Terri's case. He said he was a friend of Terri's from school who sometimes had lunch with her and walked her to her classes, but they'd never dated. Wendell said the same thing others had reported. Terri was having second thoughts about marrying Jeff. She told him they had had an argument recently, and Jeff threatened to take away the brand new BMW, which they'd bought together. She also admitted to Wendell that from time to time, Jeff would beat her as he was extremely jealous. She said he even followed her without her knowledge and would show up wherever she was, just to check up on her and see if she was seeing somebody else. It's interesting that Terri was telling everyone about her hesitation to marry Jeff, except Jeff. Detectives noticed the disconnect. Detective Simons spoke with some of Terri's co-workers at Dillard's department store in Irving, from which she had recently resigned. One of these was Terri H., yet another Terri. Terri H. said that Terri McAdams had been over to her place on several occasions when she and Jeff had been fighting. According to this Terri, Jeff treated Terri McAdams extremely poorly. Another co-worker named Glennis F. was totally convinced that Terri's boyfriend Jeff had something to do with the murder. She was adamant about it and told detectives the same thing over and over. It was Jeff. Finally, Ann McAdams came to Arlington to clean Terri's things out of her apartment. Ann had a long talk with Detective Simons in which she too expressed concern that Jeff could have killed Terri. Terri had confided in her about Jeff's jealousy and abusive behavior, and that he actually got violent with her on a number of occasions. It was time to put Jeff on the polygraph machine. But Jeff was still in Arkansas and seemed to have no plans to return. His father, Don, got on the phone with Detective Ford and demanded to know why they needed his son to return to Arlington. Detective Ford explained that they needed him to look through the apartment to see if anything else was missing or disturbed, as that would potentially help them identify a suspect. He also needed to discuss with him various matters related to the investigation, to obtain more information, and so on. This is pretty telling from Detective Ford's report, quote, "I would like to point out that throughout my experience in homicide investigations, I have never encountered an adult male companion or spouse of a victim of a homicide who has acted more emotional, childless, and evasive as Jeff B. This concerns me in regards to Jeff being a suspect to this crime in light of all the other information concerning Terri having another boyfriend, Jeff being extremely jealous and possessive, and past history indicating that Jeff has been abusive and violent to Terri," end quote. Finally, they got Jeff to promise to return to town on the 26th. In the meantime, there were plenty of other men police were looking at. One, of course, was this guy, Brent. He was the man with whom Tony had said Terri cheated on Jeff, so Detective Ford was very eager to speak with him when Brent showed up at the station saying he knew Terri. Brent was read his rights and agreed to speak with detectives. Brent worked as the bell captain at the Americana Hotel in Fort Worth. The detectives observed no injuries on his face or arms, and Brent's demeanor was relaxed and calm. He also had no criminal history whatsoever. Brent told them he'd known Terri for a year and attended several classes at UT Arlington with her. He said that she confided in him that she was having second thoughts about marrying Jeff. Brent knew that Jeff had accepted a job in Houston and that he and Terri had argued about whether Terri would also go. He said that Terri had never said she was afraid of Jeff, but she did say they had argued about breaking up and dividing up their things, including the BMW they owned together. Detectives asked Brent the last time he saw Terri, and he said it was the evening of the 12th, when she came to his apartment to get some information about a class they had together. Then Brent made a bad decision and denied that he'd ever had a sexual relationship with Terri. He said he'd gone to lunch with her a few times and spoken with her over the phone, and they'd studied together, but it never escalated. Now, of course, police knew, according to Tony J., that there had been a sexual encounter during that supposed study session on the 12th. However, Brent told them that Terri only stayed at his place for a short time and then she left. He said he spoke with her on the night of the 13th, around 6:45 p.m., and everything had been normal. Brent told the detectives that he did have some concern that Jeff could have killed Terri, but Detective Ford found it interesting that Brent had lied about his relationship with Terri. His notes say, quote, "I will recontact Brent at a later date and re-interview him and attempt to obtain hair samples and fingerprints as a possible suspect," end quote. Well, that re-interview happened on the 16th. Detective Ford asked Brent to come into the station, read him his rights, and asked him about the story told by Tony that Brent and Terri had had sex on the 12th. Well, it was true, Brent admitted. They had had sex, and Terri felt guilty about it afterwards. No, he hadn't killed Terri. Yes, he would take a polygraph. He did so on the 20th and passed with flying colors. Besides the fact that Brent didn't act particularly suspicious, the polygraph results were sufficient for Detective Ford, on the advice of the polygrapher Richard Wood, to eliminate Brent as a suspect. Then there was Terri's friend Brad C. Brad seemed to have no connection to the crime whatsoever, but he tripped Detective Ford's spidey sense when he refused to take a polygraph or even provide hair samples. This was most odd for someone who claimed to be close friends with Terri, someone who should want to assist the investigators in any way possible. Brad went onto the persons of interest list. POI or not, Brad provided some information that made Detective Ford take note. He said Terri had told him a couple weeks earlier that her fiancé traveled a lot for work, and she preferred to stay in his apartment rather than hers because one of her neighbors made her nervous. This was a white male who would stare at her whenever she would come and go from her apartment. Brad didn't know his name or exactly where he lived, but he got the impression that he lived maybe next door or right above or below Terri's apartment. Terri's friend Wendell also told Detective Ford about a guy whose first name he thought was Craig, last name unknown. This Craig guy was a business student who dressed fairly properly in khakis and a blazer, and had asked Terri out on numerous occasions. He persisted, although she always refused. Terri felt harassed by his constant requests for dates. Detective Ford also spoke with a Rick S. He was a friend of Terri's from school who said she had told him back in January about a foreign student who had been bothering her constantly, asking her out for a date even though she had refused him several times. He couldn't remember this guy's name, but he was Iranian, Pakistani, or Indian, he said. Detective Ford made a note to follow up. A week after the murder, Detective Ford contacted Crime Stoppers to ask them to feature Terri's case as Crime of the Week. He personally drove to the apartment complex and put a Crime Stoppers card on every apartment unit in Jeff's building and Terri's building with his name and phone number on the card. On the 28th, it was decided to gather a list of all residents of Jeff's building and contact them at work because they had not had a good response to the business cards or in their initial canvass. They considered it imperative to gather information as to whether anyone had seen or heard anything. Detective Ford wanted to know who the strange, staring guy was. Detective Mike Simons, who remember lived in the complex, gathered some information from tenants about some guys who lived in the complex who they felt were strange and somewhat suspicious. There was nothing connecting them to the crime other than people thinking they were weirdos. One of these was a white male named James D., who lived in apartment 1218 directly above Jeff's apartment. He had no criminal history, and he told Detective Simons he didn't know Terri and didn't know anything about the murder. The second person, named as strange, was another white male, Thomas S., who lived in apartment 214 on the third floor of the same building where Terri's apartment was. He was an employee of InterFirst Bank in Dallas and had no criminal history. Follow-up was needed on both these guys. Some other guys who were looked at worked at the Walnut Ridge complex. The complex manager was named Guy McAdams, no relation to Terri. He was very cooperative with the investigation, giving fingerprints and head and pubic hair samples. He was also noted to smoke the wrong kind of cigarettes. Guy was eager to take a polygraph so the apartment residents would be at ease, and he did so and passed. From Guy, the apartment manager, Detective Simons gathered the names of the 3 maintenance workers at the complex. They were Stephen M., Jackie S., and David V., all white males. Dave was the one who had found Terri's body, along with the pest control guy, John Daniels. None of the 3 had significant criminal histories or warrants. All 3 were questioned and gave fingerprints, head hair and pubic hair samples, and Xerox copies of the soles of their tennis shoes. Quote, "There was nothing significant obtained from the 3 subjects." End quote. All 3 men also passed polygraphs and were generally dismissed as POIs, although someone closely connected to Dave V. would later pique the investigators' interests. On the 22nd, Detective Ford contacted the pest control guy, John Daniels, to set up an appointment for a polygraph and obtain hair samples from him. John Daniels said he was employed at EnviroTroll Pest Control and was also a nighttime security guard at a nearby nursing home, as well as being a student at Arlington Baptist College. He said he had been to the Walnut Ridge apartments only 6 times before the time when he found Terri's body. John was noted not to be a smoker and was extremely cooperative and gave hair samples and fingerprints. Detective Ford did not feel a polygraph exam was necessary unless the hairs found at the scene proved to bear similarities to John, which they did not. There were some pieces of physical evidence in this case that were prioritized because of their potential connection to the suspect. One was the engagement ring. Investigators came to believe firmly that the suspect had removed the ring from Terri's finger and stolen it. The ring had been fairly expensive, appraised at $5,010, and it was of course suspected that the suspect would likely pawn it at one of the local shops for some quick cash. Jeff still had a copy of the purchase receipt for the ring, as well as a photo of it for insurance purposes, so the police obtained these and went around to area pawn shops, but no one had the ring behind the glass case or recalled seeing one like it. Another angle that was worked more to eliminate potential suspects than to identify them was the cigarette butt found on the bedroom floor. Police noted the names of men in the case file who smoked, in particular Winston Light 100s. Non-smokers like John Daniels, the pest control guy, moved down the list. It was very unlikely that he would commit a murder and then stick around to suddenly take up smoking. The cigarette butt was subjected to testing to see if the saliva could yield a blood type. Testing detected saliva on the paper wrapper, and serological analysis showed that the suspect had type B blood. Well, so did millions of other people. Type B was statistically believed to be the blood type of 11% of the U.S. population at the time. Terri was type A, though, so at least they had good reason to believe that they indeed had isolated the suspect's blood type. Remember that one good quality latent fingerprint had been obtained from the sliding glass door. It did not match Terri or Jeff or any of the maintenance men. Because this was the door that was left open with blood on the curtain covering it, it was suspected to also have been left by the killer. This print contained sufficient detail to be entered into APHIS, where it didn't match any in the database. Another important piece of physical evidence was 3 similar hairs collected from items at the crime scene. A hair was carefully picked up from Terri's blue sweatshirt, and 2 hairs that appeared consistent were gathered from the comforter. One of the most important clues the detectives had to work with in this case was the shoe print believed to have been made by the suspect. The print had been casted and photographed, so the unique piece of evidence was preserved. The print was a size 10.5 to 11.5 sneaker, back in those days called a jogging or tennis shoe. After copying the shoe tread casts and disseminating the copies to multiple shoe manufacturers and sporting goods stores, detectives were able to learn that the distinct tread pattern on the sneaker, made up of mini triangles, was consistent with a Tiger brand Commander jogging shoe, which only came in royal blue with yellow stripes. This particular shoe was last manufactured in 1979, but was distributed to retailers as late as 1981 and 1982, and was sold at sporting goods stores such as Oshman's. On this particular shoe, the tread was not very worn, indicating that the sneaker was brand new or little used. The detectives obtained a photo of the shoe from the Tiger Company and used it to show to interviewees to see if they knew of anyone with a shoe like that. The shoe was confirmed not to be owned by the apartment manager, the maintenance man, or the pest control guy. It was strongly suspected to belong to the suspect. A be on the lookout flyer with a photo of the sneaker was issued to every Arlington police officer. There is one more thing that I think could be a significant clue in this case, although I found it buried in a bullet point in a 1,749-page case file. Quote, while Detective Simons was at Terri's apartment, her own, not Jeff's, on February 21st, 1985, he noticed 2 pry marks on the inspection plate on the back sliding glass door. Detective Simons removed this particular plate and entered it into evidence for possible comparison with the plate at the apartment where Terri was found, end quote. This scratched-up lock plate was found on the door to Terri's apartment. Does this mean that the killer had tried to break into Terri's apartment as well? If so, given the fact that detectives examined all the other apartment doors and only found one other that was suspicious, that could not be a coincidence. On February 26th, nearly 2 weeks after the murder, Terri's fiancé Jeff finally agreed to return to Texas and come into the station for an interview. He was read his rights and agreed to speak with Detective Ford and Detective Barrett. Quote, Jeff did not ask very many questions concerning the investigation, which I found very unusual, end quote. As for his alibi, Jeff said he flew out of town on Monday morning, February 11th at 8:45 a.m. He was able to produce the plane tickets for his departure and return flights. He said various people could vouch for him at his conferences and meetings in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, including his friend and coworker Bruce F. They asked him detailed questions about his itinerary to see whether he was making stuff up or not. One very important thing that Jeff told Detective Ford in his interview was that on the night of February 13th, he had been out very late having drinks with coworkers at the Doubletree Inn in Tulsa. He got back to his room around 2 a.m., which was technically now February 14th. He tried to call Terri at his apartment, but received no answer. He told Detective Ford that the only phone in the apartment was in the living room and that he thought Terri was just asleep and didn't hear the phone from the bedroom. But of course, this information meant that Terri was probably dead by then. Jeff said that when he arrived at Tulsa Airport around 4:45 on Thursday, Valentine's Day, he called the apartment, expecting to get Terri to come pick him up at DFW when he landed. That's when he learned something very bad had happened. Detective Ford noted there was a major discrepancy in Jeff's story. He had been scheduled to return to Texas on Friday, not Thursday. Jeff said nothing of this, and the detective wondered if Jeff had been trying to catch Terri in a compromising position. Further, Jeff denied having any arguments with Terri regarding the transfer to Houston, which the detective knew was not true. Quote, I asked Jeff if he and Terri argued frequently or if any of their arguments became violent. Jeff described his relationship with Terri as being almost too perfect for me to believe, end quote. Jeff admitted, though, that he and Terri had gotten into an argument back in November of '84 when he'd driven up to University of Texas, Arlington to surprise Terri. He saw her getting out of a car, which Brent was driving, and they got into a fight about it, quote, at which time he did assault Terri, causing her to receive a lacerated lip. He advised they had no other violent arguments that he could remember. I reassured Jeff that most everyone has arguments with their girlfriend or spouse and cautioned him To be completely honest, due to the fact that Terri had related many of her problems concerning her and Jeff to many of her friends whom I've already contacted. Jeff again stated he and Terri had a very good relationship and very few problems, end quote. Detective Ford's notes go on to say, Jeff is obviously lying to the officers, but the reason for his lying is completely unknown. It is possible that he is lying simply because he's ashamed of the way he treated Terri. He refuses to accept that at this point in time, end quote. Detectives also learned from the Little Rock, Arkansas police that when Jeff and his former girlfriend broke up, she had to obtain a restraining order. Now, Detective Ford asked Jeff if he had any girlfriends on the side, and Jeff said he didn't. But the previous summer, he had been seeing a woman who worked for Procter & Gamble. They were no longer in contact. Quote, I asked Jeff if Terri was seeing anyone other than him, and he said no. I specifically asked about Brent D., and he said, as far as he knew, Brent was just one of Terri's classmates. There was no relationship between them, end quote. Jeff signed a consent to search and permitted the detectives to collect hair samples from his head and pubic area. He also said he didn't own any tennis shoes other than a pair of Nikes, which he didn't use very much because he wasn't a runner. And then Detective Ford threw this at Jeff, quote, I advised Jeff that we had interviewed a number of Terri's friends which had all indicated to us that they felt that Jeff might be a good suspect to this capital murder. A number of these friends have related a number of arguments between Jeff and Terri, which he has totally denied. I suggested to Jeff that the easiest and quickest way for us to clear him as a suspect would be for us to administer a polygraph exam, end quote. Jeff agreed to the poly, but it didn't happen. The next day, when Jeff was supposed to show up for the exam, his lawyer, Bill Lovelace, called instead and said he was not going to let Jeff take the poly. Detective Bloom explained that they needed to use the polygraph to once and for all eliminate Jeff, and if he wouldn't take it, they would have to consider him a suspect and start investigating him as such. He hinted that this might result in professional embarrassment to Jeff as they checked into his alibis on the business trip. Lovelace said he would pass this information along. In addition to hiring legal counsel, Jeff's dad, Don, had also hired a PI to provide proof of Jeff's whereabouts at the time of the murder. He did not trust the police and believed they were railroading Jeff. Bob Sadler, the PI, agreed to pass on to Jeff that the police felt he was not cooperating, and the polygraph would allow the police to eliminate him and devote their resources elsewhere. Jeff took a private polygraph on March 5th. It was pretty comprehensive, asking whether he knew who caused Terri's death, whether he caused Terri's death, whether he ever struck her with a weapon, whether he colluded with anyone to cause Terri's death, whether he intentionally left any doors or windows unlocked, whether he planned with anyone or gave anyone anything of value to commit the murder, and so on. Are you in any way involved in the death of Terri McAdams? Answer, no. The private polygrapher determined no deception in any of these responses and provided the results to the APD detectives for their polygraph operator, Detective Richard Wood, to analyze. Wood detected no deceptive criteria and felt that the test was appropriate. But the APD investigators still felt that, quote, there seemed to be obvious discrepancies in regards to his and Miss McAdams' relationship, end quote. So homicide detectives Zimmerman, Simons, and Bloom and Sergeant Atwell conferred on the case and decided to get subpoenas in order to access Jeff's bank records, business records, financial records, employment records, and everything else. They contacted the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office. They issued the subpoenas that were requested. The whole investigation into Jeff became very long and drawn out because Jeff's family stopped cooperating with police. Eventually, Detective Simons went to Arkansas and tracked down Jeff's father and brother and managed to get an audience with them, but received a dressing down from the father, Don, on harassing his family, so he wasn't able to gather much helpful information. Jeff and his brother, who knew Terri and was also known to be violent with women, both refused to cooperate, so no blood samples were obtained to help eliminate Jeff. Detectives' notes indicate that the family tended to exaggerate their importance in the community and felt that they could do no wrong. In August 1985, Detective Simons decided the only way he could finally and completely rule Jeff out was to go to Tulsa and retrace every single aspect of his alibi. They checked his hotel records. They checked with coworkers to see if he actually attended the events he said he'd attended. They checked phone records to make sure he'd called home when he said he did. Sure enough, the phone records showed that he called the apartment from the hotel room at 2 a.m. They found a female witness who worked in accounts receivable for Lever Brothers, who specifically recalled that Jeff and his two coworkers, Steve and Arthur, were present at all the events on the night of the 13th to 14th until very, very late at night. Arthur issued a sworn statement signed by a notary that Jeff was with him the entire time that night until about 2:30 a.m. when they left each other upon stepping out of the elevator. Quote, Jeff was not out of my sight for more than 5 minutes at any given time. Same for Stephen S., who also attested that Jeff was present that night. In the end, the APD investigators did confirm Jeff's alibi and ripped through his financial records to make sure he hadn't paid anyone to kill Terri. If he had, they could find no record of it. Jeff, their best suspect, seemed to be off the table. Terri's great-uncle was a retired FBI agent, and the APD consulted him on the case. He helped the Arlington police submit a request to the FBI for that agency to prepare a psychological profile of the suspect. On March 1st, Detective Ford met with FBI Special Agent Thomas Porter, Sergeant Atwell, Detective Simons, Detective Zimmerman, and Detective Bloom. They spent 3 hours discussing the aspects of the case and providing the FBI agent with all their case notes, photographs, and so on. Agent Porter related that in cases of severe head injuries, such as Terri's, it was generally indicative of severe anger and that the victim and the assailant knew one another. The psychological profile was prepared by Special Agent James Wright of the Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico. I don't have the entire profile, but I do have some excerpts. Quote, we would profile the offender as a white male based off his behavior and statistics that show homicide as an intra-racial crime. Your subject will be between 23 and 28 years old. The offender will have no more than a high school education. Will most likely be employed in a menial position, since an individual will most likely select a weapon with which he is familiar and comfortable. The assailant's choice of a hammer might indicate employment or past employment in a position such as a carpenter or maintenance man. The assailant resides within walking distance of the crime scene. It is our opinion the subject knew the victim and had been watching her for some time prior to the assault. This is not to say the victim in turn knew the suspect. If he resides with anyone, it will be with someone on whom he is at least partially financially dependent. It is doubtful that he is married. He is nocturnal. If the subject has come to the attention of police, it will be for peeping or similar suspicious activity. It is unlikely that the subject served in the military. The FBI profile was considered very informative. APD detectives had started to consider men in the case file who might fit the profile when on March 1st, 1985, Detective Ford was reassigned. He would no longer be working on the Terri McAdams investigation. This was not a reflection of his work product, but because the case was being reassigned to the 2-month-old Major Case Division. Detective Ford was part of the Crimes Against Persons Division, which had a very heavy caseload of cases and simply not enough investigators. The Major Case Squad under Sergeant Hugh Atwell had 6 dedicated investigators who worked cases with plentiful leads that were likely to take some time to resolve. Detective Ford dictated 50 pages of investigative sheets and placed them in the casebook to turn over to Major Case. Later that month, Terri's mother Ann established a $5,000 fund intended for anyone who came forward with information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible for her daughter's murder. When that didn't help, Major Case personnel decided to release the information to the public regarding the Tiger Commander's sneaker that they were trying to connect to the suspect. Sergeant Atwell told the media, quote, it's important because it's somewhat unique. It may be something the public has spotted. It's an unusual shoe, and we feel the print was left behind by the suspect, end quote. Sergeant Atwell was frank about the slow progress of the investigation. He told the media on March 28th that they had no real suspects, even though they'd investigated 350 leads. Quote, we just haven't gotten any information on anybody who would be capable of such a thing. We still have a lot of leads to follow up on, but they're not good, substantial suspects. All we're doing is eliminating a lot of possibilities. We're dealing with a psychotic individual here. There's no telling what else he might have done, end quote. Sergeant Atwell said they would continue to plug away at the case and continue to remain in contact with the Fort Worth Task Force investigating the murders there.
Every day, predators are targeting children and teens online. The Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect campaign provides resources to combat online child exploitation and abuse. Learn how you can help protect our kids online and join the fight. Visit knowtoprotect.gov so together we can stop online child exploitation. That's KNOW, 2, protect.gov.
Investigators became aware of an interesting incident in Terri and Jeff's complex. 2 months after Terri's murder, an arrest was made by APD of a peeping Tom, as he was referred to back in the day. This was Melvin V., the brother of the Walnut Ridge Complex maintenance man David V. Melvin lived with his brother and was arrested for window peeping in the complex. He had also done time in Arkansas for burglary. Of course, it was felt that Melvin and his brother would both know how to defeat the lock on the sliding glass door and would have the tools to do it. They would also know that Terri, who was on the lease of apartment 224, actually lived in number 1214. Detectives Bloom and Simons felt strongly that Melvin fit the FBI profile in this case. A white male who did not have an education past the 9th grade, who worked menial jobs, lived nearby, was single and nocturnal, and had been arrested on a peeping charge. Detective Bloom noted that Melvin checked the boxes on the FBI profile in 11 different instances. By the time detectives decided they needed to talk to Melvin, his brother had been fired from his maintenance job and the two had moved back to Arkansas, where they were from. Melvin was interviewed by Detective Simons in Arkansas and told him he had only spoken with Terri McAdams on one occasion when he noticed Arkansas plates on her vehicle and mentioned them to her. He said she was polite but not interested in chatting with him. He'd never been inside her apartment. He didn't seem to have any details about the murder. But he had no alibi for the night of the murder either. His brother Dave was out with his girlfriend. But Melvin's prison records showed his blood type was O positive, not the same as the man who had smoked the cigarette in Terri's bedroom. Detective Simon's notes also indicate that hair samples were compared with negative results against the unknown hair samples located at the crime scene. And the latent prints located at the crime scene also did not match Melvin. Detectives wanted to polygraph Melvin, but it just didn't happen. He'll come up again later. Another person that detectives looked into based on a tip from a Detective Corley of Richardson PD was named B.L. Hill, a white male. Corley said his department was working a homicide investigation in Richardson, which had a lot of similarities to Terri's case. This was the murder of Angela Samada, who was beaten, raped, and stabbed to death in her apartment on October 13, 1984. Hill was a maintenance man at Angela's apartment, whom investigators believed used a pass key to enter the apartment and strike sleeping Angela about the head approximately 6 to 7 times with an instrument which had been described as a pair of vice grips or channel locks. Hill was a suspect because he had been seen by another woman trying to break into her apartment via a window around 3 a.m. and she was able to identify him. Quote, "There were many similarities between his offense and our offense. The victim had been struck about the head numerous times, and she was unrecognizable after the beating. She was a white female that lived alone at that location," end quote. Hill went on the suspect list. Another potential suspect was Joel F., who lived in apartment 1204, sharing a wall with Jeff's apartment. Joel raised police eyebrows for a couple of reasons. One, Detective Ford learned that an anonymous caller called Major Case in Fort Worth and tipped that Joel F. killed Terri McAdams. The tip naming Joel was interesting because, quote, "Joel's only known connection with the investigation is the fact that he and Angela Ewert were both employed at KEGL. She is one of the white females who is missing and believed to be connected to the serial homicides in Fort Worth. It is still unknown if this Arlington homicide is related to the Fort Worth serial crimes or not," end quote. Joel F. agreed to come into the police station and gave an interview and hair samples and fingerprints. He didn't smoke and he had an alibi. He agreed to a polygraph, and detectives noted he was extremely cooperative. He was eventually crossed off the list. The first really promising suspect unknown to Terri was called in by a woman named Billy N. She was very reluctant to give her name at first, but finally revealed that her estranged husband was Andrew P., and she thought he could have killed Terri McAdams. Andrew was out all night on February 13th, 1985, and when she picked him up, he told her he had killed that woman in Arlington on the north side of town. He didn't use her name, but said he left the victim in a pool of blood in the corner of the room. Since Terri was indeed found in the corner in a pool of blood, detectives were intrigued. Billy said that her estranged husband Andrew was very violent and had assaulted her and torn up their residence on numerous occasions. Quote, "Billy also advised me that Andrew used to live in the southwest Fort Worth area, which is the area where a number of the Fort Worth unsolved homicides took place involving young white females," end quote. Billy also told them that her husband smoked Winston 100 cigarettes, which was the exact same as the cigarette butt found in the apartment. Billy gave the police permission to search the apartment she'd shared with Andrew until she recently moved out. They found it had been completely trashed, with the couch having been cut up with a knife, broken glass all over the floor, holes in the walls, and so on. They collected 3 cigarette butts into evidence and collected hair samples from a hat that Billy said Andrew had been wearing during the week of the murder. But they couldn't find Andrew, who was gone. And then there was a very important development. Sergeant Adwell received a telephone call from Tim Fallon of the Dallas Forensics Lab. Tim Fallon reported that none of the hairs in evidence matched any of the known hair standards submitted by POIs in this case. In 1985 alone, hair samples were submitted by 18 men at the request of detectives. These included potential suspects like Brent and Jeff, but also persons of interest like Dave and Melvin V. Not one of the sample hairs collected was similar to the hairs found at the scene. But there was more. Detectives' notes say, quote, although I'm substituting some language for a word that was commonly used at that time to refer to African Americans. Fallon advised of a monumental factor which is going to totally change the direction of this investigation. Fallon advised that he found African American hair on the victim's blue sweatshirt, as well as several African American hairs on the comforter, which came from the crime scene. The blue sweatshirt in question was lying on the floor in the bedroom in the crime scene and was blood-covered and appeared to have been physically removed from the victim during the assault. The comforter in question was left lying partially on the bed and partially on the floor and was definitely involved in the crime. Dallas Forensics was unable to determine from the examination whether these were pubic hairs or head hairs, end quote. Now, as I stated, this was a very important development, but it has to be said that some Caucasian hairs were also found at the crime scene, and they hadn't been linked to anyone. To clarify, 1 unidentified loose hair was found on Terry's right arm, 1 unidentified loose hair was found on Terry's left arm, 1 unidentified loose hair was found on her left thigh. 1 African American hair was found on her blue sweatshirt, and 2 African American hairs were found on the comforter. All the hairs in her hands were deemed to be her own. So while the evidence could be interpreted as pointing to an African American perpetrator, this was not definitive, as there were also some Caucasian hairs found. Still, as detectives' notes indicate, none of the first responders, crime scene personnel, detectives, funeral home employees, or anyone else who had accessed the crime scene was black. The sweatshirt and the comforter had been very carefully collected and packaged prior to even moving Terry's body. They were sent directly to Dallas Forensic Labs, sealed against contamination. So the investigators now had reason to believe that the man who attacked and killed Terri might be black. And at this point in time, they had approximately 0 black men in the suspect pool. It was back to the drawing board. The detectives pursued the angle that Terri had been stalked by one of the students she shared classes with, whom she described as Iranian or Indian. This was the guy who would not take no for an answer as far as going out with Terri. The detectives interviewed people at UT Arlington and learned this guy was named Waleed Hosseini. And Waleed looked like a very good suspect for a time, because not only had Terri told people he was harassing her, he lived in the same apartment complex. Detective Larry Bloom interviewed Waleed on the 14th of March, 1985. He read him his rights and questioned him. Waleed said he barely remembered Terri, although he did have a class with her the previous semester, and he thought he did a project with her for school. But they didn't have any dates, he didn't have her phone number, and the relationship was purely academic. He denied killing Terri and gave head and pubic hair samples and fingerprints for comparison to materials and evidence. He was ruled out. For over a year, major case detectives worked every conceivable angle on the Terri McAdams case. Detective Bloom was instrumental. He started contacting all Terri's professors to see if any men in her classes had been significantly absent around the time of her murder. He and Detective Zimmerman went to the Walnut Ridge apartment complex and just picked up any Winston 100 cigarette butts they found on the ground. They also worked with the street department for the city of Arlington, requesting that workers climb into the nearby manholes and check the storm sewers for any evidence. In one of the nearby storm sewers located directly west of the laundromat in Building 12, a 2.5-foot length of rebar steel rod was located. It was bent on one end, and one of the ends had some dark-colored hairs on it. Needless to say, this was collected as possible evidence, but the hairs on it proved not to have originated from Terri. Detective Bloom attended the Dallas County Crime Analyst meeting and handed out flyers about Terri's murder, including a photo of the ring that was missing. He ran pawn files against every name that came up from every tip or piece of information in the investigation to see if anyone had a record of pawning items. He checked into the subject of a tip named Jerry Martin, who was a known drug addict who had recently given a diamond ring to his fiancé, Donna H. It was thought this could possibly be Terri's missing ring, but it wasn't. It was way too small. Detective Bloom typed up reports on each and every one of the 90-plus male residents of the 4 buildings in the Walnut Ridge apartment complex that had a view of Terry's or Jeff's apartment or who lived in their buildings. Criminal histories were run on each and every one of them. The police took note that there was a quite large construction project going on building a complex east of the Walnut Ridge apartments. While the detectives despaired of being able to locate the construction workers in the complex who were all noted to be illegals, they actually looked into each and every resident of neighboring complexes. Detective Bloom worked on attempting to obtain clear handprints from the bloody prints on Terry's thighs, which were made by bare, ungloved hands. He got the shoe print cast sent to the FBI lab to see if they could come up with any additional information. He followed up on tips and leads on men like rapist Robert Scott, a black male who had been convicted of raping some women in Arlington, and Buster Dwayne Willis, another black male who had been arrested for a nearby residential burglary. Detective Zimmerman pulled all 1985 APD reports where black suspects were stopped who had criminal histories for sex offenses. The list of these sex offenders included the names Pointer, Keener, Burns, and Sharp, all of whose prints were on file, were submitted to the lab for comparison to the prints on the sliding door. They also made a list of all black males arrested since the first of the year and took a look at them if they had committed a similar crime or a burglary or a property crime nearby. Detective Simons, the one who lived in the Walnut Ridge apartment complex, was also very involved in this stage of the investigation. I hate to say it, but a lot of black guys who lived in the Walnut Ridge complex or nearby complexes were talked to, simply because of the African-American hairs found on Terry's body. Detective Simons was in charge of this angle of the investigation. He completely canvassed 6 different apartment complexes in the vicinity and identified each and every black man living in those complexes. Only 9 had any significant criminal histories, and 1 had a criminal sex offense arrest. This was Maurice Boyd, who lived in apartment 1010 at the Walnut Ridge Apartments. He had an arrest in 1980 in Chicago for contributing to the sexual delinquency of a child, but charges were dropped. Detective Simons spoke with him on April 8th. Maurice maintained that the victim in the Chicago case was lying, put up to it by an ex-girlfriend of his. He was eliminated through fingerprints and hair samples, but stayed on the investigators' radar for decades. Several months into the investigation, samples from more than 25 men had been collected. Some of these were Dave V., the maintenance man in the complex; Raymond Hall, a rape suspect in the area whose offense did not match the MO in Terry's case, but was looked at just in case; Simon T., a student at UT Arlington who was taking finance courses just like Terry. He was arrested in the 3rd week in April in 1985 after some neighbors saw him prowling on the porch of a woman named Sadia T. at 12:11 in the morning. Simon was arrested for criminal trespass. He was also facing burglary charges for breaking into a young woman's apartment on South Cooper Street and hitting her on the head. Quote, the suspect told the patrol officer while being booked that he elected to take women's clothing, especially women's panties, and play with them, end quote. After the April arrest, detectives interrogated Simon for an hour and a half, and he willingly gave hair and saliva samples. Looking at a photo of Terri, he said he had nothing to do with her case, but he realized he had a problem. Sometimes the urges became too strong, and he couldn't control himself. He reiterated that he liked to play with women's underwear. Remember that Terry's underwear, if she had been wearing any, were missing. When the detectives asked if they could come back to Simon's apartment and search it, he lawyered up. Other guys who had given samples and could not be definitively ruled in or out included Jeff, who was alibied and passed a poly; Brent; John Daniels, the pest guy, who didn't smoke and didn't trip any creepometers among the detectives; Guy McAdams, the complex manager, who passed a polygraph; Little Joe Alexander, a known offender whose prints and hair did not match; Stephen M., a maintenance man at the complex who passed a polygraph; Michael G., another man named by other residents of the apartment complex as a suspicious weirdo. He moved out of his apartment in the Walnut Ridge complex right around the first week of March, but he had started paying rent at his new apartment in the Royal Meadows complex on February 15th, the day after Terri was found. He smoked Winston 100 Lights cigarettes. He had also recently separated from his wife. Detectives noted that his apartment location required him to walk past Terry's apartment to get to his own. His apartment was situated perfectly to observe the comings and goings of apartment 1214, Jeff's apartment. Detectives tracked Michael G. down at his new complex and noticed that he was strange and antisocial. Detectives thought it was weird that they knocked on his door and he admitted them and allowed them to interview him, but he never asked any questions whatsoever about the specifics of the crime or what they were investigating. He also told them he smoked Camel Lights and Marlboro Lights, but never mentioned Winston Lights, although the cleaning person at his old apartment said that's what he smoked. Michael gave hair samples, prints, and a cigarette butt and passed a polygraph even though his attorneys advised him against taking one. Another guy who was side-eyed was a guy named Hamayun Didabani, another resident of the complex, apartment 1211, who was side-eyed for some reason, I hope not because of his name. He agreed to come down to the police station and give hair samples and fingerprints, which did not match the evidence. Basil P., another resident considered a weirdo. He was known to walk around the complex at all hours of the night. Detective Simons knew him from years past as a troublemaker with a violent temper. He had a fairly recent arrest by the APD for criminal mischief. Police took a hard look at him because randomly his name was found on a deposit ticket in a breezeway at a separate apartment building where a woman had recently been flashed by an unknown male in a case of indecent exposure. This happened just 2 weeks before Terri's murder. Again, samples failed to link him to the crime. Thomas S., a resident of the complex who was the subject of a tip saying he was a weirdo and had been in a mental institution. Thomas didn't smoke and his samples didn't match the evidence. Jackie S. was another maintenance man at the complex. He passed a polygraph. James D., who lived directly upstairs from Jeff and was shifty. He told detectives that Terri was a little uppity and would not communicate with him if they were to meet in the stairway. Detective Simons noted that James seemed quite aware of Terri's comings and goings from the apartment complex. However, he willingly gave head hair and pubic hair samples as well as fingerprints. He passed a polygraph, and nothing connected him to the crime. Andrew P., whose wife had reported him saying he told her he killed a woman in Arlington. They never found him, but collected cigarette butts of his from his wife, and they did not match. Alan C. was a drug informant who saw Terri's photo in the paper and reported that he had sold drugs to her. No one believed this, and Alan had no evidence of it. But since he had inserted himself in the investigation and smoked Winston Light 100s, he was considered a person of interest. Cigarette butts were collected from him for comparison. Buster Wayne Willis, a North Side burglar who was looked at because he was good at burglary. He passed a polygraph and was deprioritized. Wendell B., Terri's male friend from UT Arlington. He had repeatedly asked her out, but she declined. All these men whose samples were collected, who were interviewed, who were vetted and polygraphed, and there was nothing to show for it. None of them killed Terri McAdams. This is the end of part 1 of the Terri McAdams case. Part 2 is available right now.